Welcome to Justice Counts, the podcast that goes beyond the law to what's important to you. Equal justice for all is a guidepost for our nation, but how do we achieve that? Here are your hosts, writer-commentator Bob Gaddy and novelist-attorney Mark M. Bello.
On May 15th, the Southern Baptist Convention, that's the Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Church, finally acknowledged what our guest today has already experienced, that pastors and other church employees have sexually abused parishioners, and that the church covered up those claims for years. Now, our guest, Sandy Phillips Kirkham, was not a member of the Southern Baptist when she was sexually abused by her youth pastor. She was a member of another Protestant denomination, which shows that such practices certainly go beyond religious boundaries. She recounts her story in Let Me Pray Upon You, a memoir that reveals how a charismatic youth minister preyed upon her, betrayed her in the most vile way, and shattered her faith, leaving her broken and separated from the church she once loved. Sandy's here with author-attorney Mark Bello and me today to discuss this tragic situation. Sandy previously told her own story on both the Lean to the Left and Justice Counts podcasts. But Mark and I wanted to invite her back to get her thoughts about these latest revelations regarding the Southern Baptist. A list of hundreds of pastors and other church-affiliated personnel accused of sexual abuse has just been released by church officials. The list had previously been kept secret by the church. Sandy, welcome back.
Thank you.
Really happy to have a chance to speak with you again about this. And I know this must have, when you saw this, it must have just sent you for a loop.
It really did. It sent me to an emotional tailspin. I had a couple days, really rough days, because I think it brought back all the memories. And this is so identical to my own story. This is nothing new. And I had to, I think, relive everything that I gone through and the lack of justice that I got. The response of the church and how they treated me. It just was very difficult to relive that. And I wasn't surprised by this. I have been in contact with Krista Brown, who has been calling for reform and demanding justice for victims for the last 15 years. There have been advocates and victims speaking out against this forever. And the church chose to ignore it, thinking they could get away with it.
Yeah. So you weren't surprised. Why do you think that they did? I mean, what's the motive for just covering this stuff up all this time?
I think their motive is money and reputation, how they feel it's going to hurt the church and people won't accept them as who they are. It's a closed culture. They feel like they can do this and get away with it. It's maddening, and it's so frustrating to believe that people would actually cover up sex crimes of children because of wanting to protect the reputation or protect the income of the church. And that's what their lawyers told them, that, financially you cannot expose these men, so you need to protect them.
Because of lawsuits that would result, right?
Yes. They systematically not only kept these men protected and moved them from church to church, they also were very sure to make sure the victims stayed quiet with non-disclosures and to play upon their religious beliefs that you need to forgive and that all people make mistakes and it'll be your fault if you expose him. And that's basically what I was told, that I was going to ruin the church if I came forward with his abuse. And that's what victims are. They're put in a position that they feel like it's their fault if they come forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't remember, frankly. I know we talked about this before, but did you file a lawsuit in your case against the church?
I tried to file which I guess it was like a civil suit. I didn't have any legal recourse because of statute of limitations. Also because the age that I was 16 at the time, and at that time age of consent was 16. It's no longer. So I had a couple issues going, but the statute of limitations prevented me from trying to do anything. I couldn't do anything legally or civilly because of the statute of limitations. And that's still true in many states. States are moving toward allowing victims of child abuse to come forward years later. And I think I've mentioned this before, but the average age for a victim of child abuse to come forward is 52. That's the average age they finally do come forward. I was 49.
50,
I was 49.
52.
Yes, they wait that long.
You were
Yes.
49, and this happened when it started when you were 16. It went on
5
for
years.
a while, 5 years. So till you were 21. So, my goodness, 20 plus years it took for you to come out about this.
And so when people talk about, well, why don't victims speak up? The trauma has created in our lives is so great that we don't, first of all, we don't want to relive it. We've been told by our abusers that no one's going to believe us. We're going to be at fault for telling anyone. And that fear of coming forward is so overwhelming that we keep the secret until, in my case, there was a trigger that forced me to face my past, or we begin to see those around us are speaking out. And so we give them the courage to speak out. You know, staying silent it's not a choice. It's our way of surviving. It's how we survive what was done to us.
Yeah. Now, what happened to the youth pastor who abused you? Was he allowed to continue working?
Yes, he was. Yes.
Preacher?
I was told by his supervisor that he had been transformed. He was a different man, and that I had a limited ability of who he was now compared to where he was 27 years ago, and that I should trust him. I should trust his supervisor to do the right thing. You know, and no one in the congregation was aware of his past. And now this was after he had admitted to multiple cases of sexual misconduct. He was identified as a sexual addict. In his own words, that's what he told me. So this was clearly not a man who belonged as a pastor. And it doesn't matter if it was one time or two times. He'd lost that privilege of ministry. And that's what the Southern Baptist, they have failed to see, that this is not a mistake. This is not just something that can be forgiven. If you want to forgive them, but they don't remain in the pastor position. They just don't.
Yeah. Do you dream about what happened to you?
Pardon me?
Do you dream at night about what happened?
Yes, I do. And the dreams aren't as frequent as they used to be because of my healing process. But this certainly has brought them back. I talked to my husband about it the other night, and he understood how difficult this has been, and he knew it would be. And again, I think it just, I watch these young girls come forward, and I know the courage it takes to do that, and then they're rebuffed by the church. They're not only rebuffed, but they're told they're evil. They're told that they're doing Satan's work. One girl who was 14 when her abuse happened, she became pregnant. She was forced to apologize to the church for her sins, and then she was forbidden to name the abuser, who was the pastor. And it's a cultural thing. I mean, it's how they manipulate victims who are already vulnerable, who have been traumatized, and they believe in the church, they trust pastors, and so I know it seems inconceivable that someone could be told to do that, and they do it. But yeah, they do.
To be clear, these leaders that you're referring to, these church leaders, I presume they're all men.
Yes.
Right?
In the Baptist and in the church I grew up in, women are not permitted to have any leadership role, whether it's the elders, the pastor of the church. They're allowed to teach Sunday school as long as there's no men in the class. There's a very limited role of women in the evangelical, independent type churches. So, as you pointed out, it's not just Baptist churches. It's more prevalent in the churches that have a more conservative view of women and their role.
I imagine they're allowed to play the piano.
They're allowed to play the piano. And like I said, they can teach children, they can teach maybe young teenage boys, but once they become adults, they're not permitted to teach. And again, it's a cultural thing. And I was on the website looking at their seminaries, and all of their classes for women, they were on how to be an effective pastor's wife, how to support your husband. Had a class on if your husband is trying to attain his PhD, how to support him and love him during this difficult time as he pursues his PhD. Those are the classes they teach. It's a supportive role to your husband. And they use the Bible verse, Ephesians, I think it's 5:22, women are to be submissive to their husbands. That's their basis of their theology. And so when you grow up in that culture, it's very difficult to remove yourself and to think for yourself, so that when you're told this is what you need to do or this is how you should behave, you don't question it. You don't know how to question it. You've not been taught to question it.
Yeah. This brings back a lot of memories for me. I don't know if I told you this before, but my father was a
Yes.
Protestant minister, and my mom played the piano in church. And her job was to support my dad in every way she could for the church. Same stuff. I remember it. I'm seeing it in my head. Anyway, executive committee leaders said of the Church of the Baptist said that publishing the list is, quote, an initial but important step towards addressing the scourge of sexual abuse and implementing reform at the convention. Now, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think words are easy. I don't trust them. I would be interested to know if they would follow the recommendations, which number one, they said they had to create a database. They should offer compensation to victims. I've not seen many churches do that because, again, it costs them money. They said they should limit non-disclosure agreements. Those should not be a part of any victim counseling or support. You should never tell a victim they need to remain silent and that they're never to talk about whatever was done to them in the church. They also talk about they need to create a new entity to deal with abuse. In other words, they need to get another group that's not part of the inner workings of the church to start dealing with this abuse. It would be interesting to see if they come close to implementing any of those things.
Yeah, it will be. Those leaders went on to say this: each entry in this list reminds us of the devastation and destruction brought about by sexual abuse. Our prayer is that the survivors of these heinous acts find hope and healing, and that churches will utilize this list proactively to protect and care for the most vulnerable among us. Now, in your case, Sandy, how long did it take for you to find hope and healing, and what did it do to your own faith?
It shattered my faith. He contaminated every part of my life within the church. All the things that had been important to me, like prayer, communion, fellowship with other people in my community, all of that was taken away from me by what he had done to me. And it will never be the same. I will never have the same trust and faith that I see people have in the church today. And I mourn that. I miss it to some extent. But I'm also smarter. I understand that I have a right to question and I have a right to be able to say I don't believe this certain way, which, before I followed along. I talk about it in my book, and the chapter's called Spiritual Wounds. It's forever damaged my spiritual life in a way. And he took that from me. He took it from me.
Yeah.
I'm never going to be fully healed. As I said, this report coming out just sent me into an emotional tailspin. It brought it all back up again. It never goes away. Triggers are easily more managed now, but they still come. I still have dreams and nightmares, and I can't control that. It's not as frequent because as I move along in my healing, but he will always be, and his abuse will always be a part of my life. Doesn't have to define my life, but he changed me. He changed me.
Mm-hmm. So, Mark, you wrote a wonderful book, Betrayal of Faith, and you fictionalize a massive cover-up in the Catholic Church. You want to talk about that a little bit and ask, maybe you've got a question or two for Sandy?
I'm sorry to say I'm not surprised by her experience. And I want the people to know that I wrote a novel about this topic, but I also handled an actual case that the novel was based on. And the Catholic Church, as an organization, not as a religion, I don't condemn Catholics. In fact, I don't even use the word Catholic in the novel because I didn't want to pick on Catholics. And as Sandy's experience has shown, it isn't limited to the Catholic Church. But what I don't understand, and what I depicted pretty graphically in the novel, is this conspiracy slash cover up. Somehow somebody in higher aspects of religious organizations believe that lying and covering up crimes is a better strategy than truth and bringing criminals to justice. And I'm wondering how Sandy feels about that in her experience, and whether she encountered, not just in her case, but in perhaps researching other cases, that this seems to be a trend, and why she thinks it is. I what gets me, and I know I'm rambling a little bit, but I can't help it.
Well, you do that.
It's much more expensive and much more damaging to cover it up than it is to expose it and get rid of it. And why does she think they choose the former rather than the latter?
Well, we talked a little bit earlier. Like I said, I think it's money. I think it's the fear of their reputation. I think they've set themselves up in this bubble and they think they can control and that no one can touch them. So they have a right to do as they think they should please to do. I will tell you, as a victim, many of the ones that I've counseled and talked with, we all think if we tell the truth and come forward, we will be received and that they're going to believe us to some extent, we hope, and that they're going to do the right thing. And we're never met with that. I mean, it is incredible the number of victims I talk to that tell me they're either told that it was, in my case, well, this happened 27 years ago. It has no validity to today. You waited too long to come forward, and we can't discipline him now for something he did 27 years ago. And so it really re-victimizes us. It sends us back 10 steps in our healing process because we have believed in the church. We have accepted that they are people of caring, loving people. And most of them in the pews are, but the leadership, rotten. I mean, and they will do everything they can to protect the reputation. And it's a kind of a good old boys network. I mean, they're protecting each other because they're colleagues, they're friends. They can't stand up for the truth because they don't want to hurt their friend. And I will also tell you, many of them that were defending, especially some of them in the Baptist church, they themselves had been accused of sexual misconduct. So, they don't want anyone exposed because they themselves may be. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This list is 700 people. That means each of these pastors, have had probably 3 to 4 victims minimum. So 700 times 3. And that's only the ones they know of or that they decided to put on the list. I can assure you, there are some that are so high up in the Baptist church organization that they won't even put them on the list. So, yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I worry that they're...
Do you think that the strategy is successful? Do you think that their cover-up is such that...
Yeah, for sure.
There are thousands, millions, hundreds of people whose abuse has not been exposed?
No, it's not successful. And I will tell you that the reason years ago, victims never came forward. Well, now victims are speaking out and they're coming forward with their stories. And when one comes forward, then another comes forward. This will not end. Cover-ups never work. Ask Richard Nixon. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And I had a priest say to me one time, he was an advocate for victims. And he said, the church is worried about airing their dirty laundry. Well, when you don't air your dirty laundry, it begins to stink. And that's what's happened. And I think they truly believed that they could get away with this. I mean, that's the arrogance of it all. And here's the thing that they will use as an excuse. And this was exactly what was said to me. When I was so frustrated that this man who had sexually abused me, who had admitted to many other incidents of sexual abuse, said, well, our churches operate independently. They're on their own. We have no control over what who they hire, what kind of people they want to put in leadership positions. So that's how they get away with it. They're under the umbrella of the Baptists. They're under the umbrella of the Disciples of Christ.
Well, given that, if the church is set up in such a way that every individual parish or church is independent from the head, right? Then how would a public database of abusers work?
Well, that's the problem. But they say they're independent, they're all independent, but they all have some kind of an executive board, or they work together on missionaries. They have, in my case, all the churches in the area sent their kids to the same camp. I mean, there is a loosely fit organization there. So, and in the Baptist case, apparently a letter was sent to the church, all of the churches who are independent. We would highly recommend that you do some education on sexual abuse and watch for signs as to probably then avoid any litigation. In other words, if you show some kind of good faith that you're trying to protect your children and your vulnerable adults in your congregation, if you show some effort, then you'll probably avoid litigation. It wasn't even done for the purpose of saying we need to protect our congregations. It was done to say, here's how we can avoid litigation. Just throw something out there to show that you might be trying to protect your children. I mean, that was the letter that was written. I mean, I'm not making that up. That was, on a website that, and as you know, if you want to Google this, you will just find yourself sickened by what's out there on the Baptist Church and how they cover this up. And their theology and their culture of how they treat women and why this is so pervasive in this evangelical world.
Maybe the three of us just can't answer these questions, but I'm just astounded by the report. I'm amazed that how closely it follows what the Catholic Church has done for probably a century or more. It didn't work there. It's not working here. Cover-ups are always exposed. It ends up costing more money. What is trying to be accomplished by covering it up? And why don't they get rid of the predators? In the Catholic Church, the excuse I kept hearing when I was handling the real case was, there's a shortage of priests.
So let's get some bad ones.
My response was, use lay people then, but don't use criminals. Don't use people who abuse and damage for life children. I just don't understand the motivation. I'm Jewish, so Jesus is not something that is part of my life. But if you're religious and Jesus is an important part of your life, what would Jesus say about this? I mean, come on.
Right.
It used to be in the Catholic Church, and not so in the Baptist Church. But in the Catholic Church, the excuse was, well, if you don't let priests marry and have a normal sexual lifestyle, then you're a breeding ground for predators. That's not true in the Baptist Church.
Predators are everywhere, and it has nothing to do whether you're married or not married. And if you are a sick individual, that kind of behavior is going to come out whether or not you're married. And as you know, in the Baptist Church, they're married. Most of these men are married that have been convicted or accused. So, I think there's this attitude that women and children are be submissive, and so they're to be used. When you got a culture like this that's been for centuries, it's really hard to, figure out. It's beyond pale how you can even imagine that someone would know that someone literally took a child at 14, got her pregnant, and then says, well, we're going to have you ask the church for your forgiveness, but you're not to name the predator who is the pastor. I mean, there's a woman in Indiana. There's a video out that was on, and her predator is standing before the church, asking forgiveness, talking about how he made a mistake. She grabbed the mic from him. I should have had it here that I could give it to you, but it's an incredible video. If you Google sex abuse Indiana. It'll pop up. But everyone started hugging the pastor as she's standing there crying. She's crying and she has to leave the church, and they're hugging the pastor. I mean, how does that happen?
Yeah.
It just does.
So victim shaming has been going on for a long time. I have a question for you. You probably don't know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
The underlying message here, despite Bob and I being relatively law-abiding citizens, is that
relatively
men,
speak for yourself there, Bello.
is that men are pigs.
That I agree with. My wife tells me that all the time.
The vast majority of sexual predators are men. I'm wondering if the instances, the frequency of instances in church settings are similar to sexual abuse cases outside of a church setting. There's no more sexual predators in the clergy than there are in other areas of life. Are there?
I would say yes, there are more predators within the church. I don't know that we've got a rash of stockbrokers who have been accused of sexual misconduct and sexual abuse. I think, certainly hear of doctors and psychologists. What happens is these men look for places to be predatory on. So churches are the prime place to be. You're automatically given trust when you're the pastor. You have total access to everyone in that church. No one questions any kind of behavior. So these men are drawn to these places. They look for places where they can find easy prey, and churches are the perfect spot. So yes, I think it is more prevalent within the churches than it is in most. I don't think you find lawyers being accused. Yes, you'll have a few, but not to the masses that we find in churches, as I'm not the Catholic Church or the Baptist
I'm not going to
Church.
disagree with you. Where I push back is, I think, and the point I was trying to make subtly, is this cover-up idea. I don't think if a stockbroker molests a coworker, that's going to get covered up at Merrill Lynch. And I'm not picking on Merrill Lynch. It's hypothetical.
No, right.
If a lawyer, sexually harasses the secretary, she'll quit and sue him. It's not news. What's news, and why this is so baffling to me, is the cover-up. An organization, the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, whoever it is, steps at the corporate level, let's call it, the hierarchy level, to protect the predators and cover up the crimes.
I think this all stems from hypocrisy. Honestly, I mean, these people come out as being so religious and so holy, and they tell you how to live your life. And if you do this, you'll just be fine, and all of that. And then they go and do this kind of stuff. I mean, and then in order to protect themselves, they cover it up because it's shameful to be seen as a hypocrite.
Yes, I think that's a good point, that they don't want to be seen as, people aren't going to go to their church if they know they've got this sexual predator. And the thing is, though, the society understands that you could hire someone and not know that they were a sexual predator, but once you discover that, they expect then that person to be removed and be dealt with and to help the victim. And when they don't do that, to me, if they're worried about the reputation of the church, that does more damage. Like the cover-up always does more damage. Always does more damage.
You're so right. The first step when a sexual predator does his thing should be scorn, call the cops, get him arrested, get in front of it, and move on. And correct whatever the problem is that got him hired in the first place. Instead, they engage in this behavior, and to your point earlier, they're going to get caught, and they get caught every time.
My predator has still good standing within the Disciples of Christ Church. I confronted him. I confronted his supervisor. I went to the president of the denomination in Indianapolis. I did everything I could to get to a step to say, this man should not be in pastor. He's not safe. And all I got was, well, we think he is, and we're going to keep him. How do you fight that? How do you make sense of someone who looks at you and says, and I could tell them horrific stories of the abuse. This wasn't someone who just, had a little sex with this 16-year-old girl. This was someone who sexually abused me, who used physical abuse against me, who manipulated and controlled me for 5 long years. And, well, that's okay because it happened so long ago. And we believe in forgiveness. That's the other thing. I think there's an issue. We believe in forgiveness, and we believe God gives second chances. And we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so therefore we should forgive. And that's the mantra in which they base their reasoning on why they keep some of these men.
What about other victims? Have there been other victims in the 27 years since yours?
Yes. Now, they've not all been minors. He admitted to having, multiple incidences with adult women in the church, and people say, well, that doesn't count. Yes, it does. He's in a position of power. He's in a position to have influence over this person. If she's coming to him for counseling, that's no different than going to a psychiatrist. He used that as a way to get to her. He had one woman sue him. She and her husband sued him. And yet because he's charismatic, he brings in people, he brings in money, and he plays on their sympathies as well. And so he's a great guy, and let's just keep him and when he semi-retired, he was given an honorable minister's pin, a presentation. I mean, I got the picture. There he is having this pin put on because he's a great guy.
One thing that gets me about this is a minister is often called upon to do marriage counseling.
And there I am on the sidelines.
And so here you could conceivably have a situation where the husband doesn't know that his wife is fooling around with the preacher. And so the husband goes to the preacher and asks them to sit and help them get their marriage together. And he's the one causing the whole thing to fall apart.
Yes. I will tell you, Bob, that happens more than you think. The husband and wife team that started the Hope of Survivors. They started the Hope of Survivors ministry, and that was the case. She went to him for counseling, and he began to tell her, well, your husband doesn't understand you. Your husband doesn't know how to do this. I do. Let me help you. And she found herself that she was being, taken advantage by this minister that she was supposedly supposed to be able to trust. The trust factor, people don't understand that either. The trust that we put in these men, whether it's justified or not, that's how we are taught. And that not that they're perfect, but we are certainly told that they're representatives of God, and they have a higher standard, and they would never do anything that would be out of line, and that we should trust them and never question them. And when you've been told that over and over, and people around you in the church believe all that, that's a hard hurdle to get over especially when that first sexual encounter happens, because you're so shocked that you try to justify it, that whatever he's doing is okay because he's the pastor.
He does have intimate knowledge of the marriage relationship, though.
Right. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, Mark. We're laughing that this stuff is.
No, but if you don't laugh, you cry.
It's not funny. I know.
I know. How much faith do you have, Sandy, that the Baptist Convention officials will follow through on their promise to effectively and fairly investigate these reports?
I'm very skeptical, but I think as long as survivors and advocates stay on their heels, it's going to be tough for them not to make some major changes. And they're going to have to get rid of this attitude and this idea that, women are less and that they should submit to men. They're going to have to have a cultural change, and I don't see that happening. I don't see that part of it happening.
The case that I handled, that Betrayal of Faith, my novel is based on, happened in 1977. It was the second incident that I uncovered that this priest was guilty of. There were 2 boys in my case. There were 4 boys in the previous case. And those incidents happened in 1971. Post lawsuit and lawsuit settlement, he got transferred 3 or 4 times until I wrote newspapers and warned post lawsuit communities that they had a predator in their midst and to be careful. He finally got defrocked. But here I am in my 30s in 1984 handling this 77 incident as a lawsuit. If you'd have told me in 1984, when I was 82 rather, I settled it in 84. If you'd have told me that we'd be discussing this 50 years later, that this wouldn't have been dealt with severely, that there'd be an explosion of cases like this, because mine was one of the early ones, I would have told you you're crazy. So to answer your question, that I know you posed it to her and not to me, but I have zero confidence that they will deal with this, because they'll do what they've always done, which is cover up future crimes. They think it's in their best interest to lie and cheat and steal about it and pay off victims. And by the way, the other thing in the litigation setting is that they pay more money to victims to sign confidentiality agreements. My victims got offered more money to sign a confidentiality agreement, and I persuaded them not to. I discounted the fee instead. I didn't want a confidentiality agreement. I wanted this to follow him wherever he went, and he finally got defrocked. 50 years later, by the way, this very same priest gets finally charged criminally with incidents that I didn't even know about, and he's now in prison after a plea deal with the Attorney General of Michigan. It's just unbelievable to me that this continues 50 years later, and Sandy's 27 years ago is a perfect example of the same behavior in her church. It's unexplainable, but I have zero confidence that they will investigate, get to the root of the problem, and, quote, solve it, unquote. It won't happen.
And I can assure you, this list that they put out, they didn't put all the names on that list. There are higher ups that they have protected and will continue to protect. 700, that's not even close to the numbers that's out there. And so that's the other thing I feel isn't going to happen.
And that's just the Southern
Right.
Baptists.
Right.
You think about all the other denominations that are out there,
Right,
that are just as crazy. Now they say they'll set up a hotline for survivors to report abuse, to report these allegations. Mm-hmm. In fact, let's say what it is. It's 202-864-5578. Or people can call SBC hotline at guidepostsolutions.com. Now, callers are supposed to be provided with care options and connected with an advocate. Would this have been helpful to you if that had been the case when all of this happened to you, Sandy?
I think it would have been. I think one thing victims are fearful of is, that no one's going to believe them. If you've got someone who says, okay, you can tell us and we'll listen. Mm-hmm. I don't know where it'll go from there after that. And again, I think the counseling, if it's church related, I'd be real skeptical of that.
Yeah, Bob. Where does the hotline go?
Yeah.
Who are the counselors?
I haven't any idea. I didn't call it to find out.
See, if they're doctors and psychologists and lay people,
Yeah.
and not and independent of the church, I would have much more confidence in it than I do if it's members.
I went on the Southern Baptist website, and they have a link there to say report abuse. Well, like I said, I have a concern that that's on the Baptist website, that they're going to,
to who,
yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's like they need to send them to someone independently apart from the church. Otherwise, you're not going to get the counseling that you should get.
Right.
That would be my concern as to where the counseling is. And now I will tell you, there's a website. I love this website. It's BaptistAccountability.org, and that organization, they have put pictures up of anyone who's been accused or has been found guilty or has been removed from the Baptist church due to sexual abuse, and they've got their picture and the stories up. It's an interesting site. I encourage people to look at it. It's called BaptistAccountability.org. There's also another one called StopBaptistPredators.org. They've been around for 15, 20, almost 20 years. Again, and the Baptist Church, the convention ignored
it. If they turned over this counseling issue to organizations like that, it would be much more credible to me than if they're handling it themselves in-house.
Yes.
I just called that number.
It might be busy.
I'm going to play whatever the recording is or however they answer the phone. Let's see what they say.
Hello, you have reached the Guidepost Solutions SBC Sexual Abuse Hotline. Please provide your name, date and time of your call, and an email address if possible for contact. We will contact you within the next business day to speak to you directly or schedule a time for a more detailed interview. If you do not want to call back, please state so in your message. You may also submit your information via email at sbchotline@guidepostsolutions.com. If you or someone you know is the victim of ongoing abuse of any nature, please reach out to law enforcement or call 911. Thank you for calling and providing your important information.
All right.
Guidepostsolutions.com.
Guidepost is the source of this report.
There is a Guidepost that is a religious magazine that was out. That's what I remember as a kid. I'm assuming it's somewhat the same.
I assumed the same thing because when I was a kid, I remember seeing Guideposts. Yeah, little magazine we used to read.
Guideposts.
Yeah.
Sandy, are you aware of any incidents that go back further than 27 years in the Baptist Church?
Oh well, there was one before me. That he admitted to.
That's the same priest
when he was.
Same
pastor.
Are you aware of any other pastors?
Yes.
That are guilty of this?
Not personally, only through other victims and their own experiences. I testified in court for one victim in Maryland. They fortunately did not have a statute of limitations, so she was sexually abused at age 14. And he ended up going to jail. He's out now. He's actually on the Baptist website. He was Baptist. He was on the website. His picture's up there. But I don't know of anyone that I know of personally.
I'm struck by the hypocrisy of this. I had some experience with Southern Baptists when I first got married. We moved into a neighborhood, and we got visited by what they call Welcome Way.
Yeah.
And it turned out it was a Southern Baptist visit. They found out we were Jewish.
So forget you.
And did not accept Jesus. And did not accept Jesus as our Savior. So we were going to hell. And what I'm thinking here now, I've been married almost 50 years. What I'm thinking here all these years later is simply not accepting Jesus Christ as your Savior is a ticket to hell, but abusing women and children is
Right.
not. What hypocrisy! The arrogance and hypocrisy of these people just blows my mind.
Oh, yeah. Hey, guys, thanks. We're going to take a quick break here, but I'll be right back with some closing comments, so hang on. Sandy, thanks for joining us today on Justice Counts. It was an informative and fascinating conversation, and timely too. And Mark Bello and I are grateful. Thanks, everyone, also for listening. Meanwhile, if you haven't done so already, please check out Mark Bello's Ripped from the Headlines Legal Thrillers, all available on Amazon.com and other major online booksellers. You know, he has quite the hero in attorney Zachary Blake, who fights for justice on all fronts. His books are Betrayal of Faith, Betrayal of Justice, Betrayal in Blue, Betrayal in Black, Betrayal High, Supreme Betrayal, Betrayal at the Border, and his latest, You Have the Right to Remain Silent. For more information, just check markmbello.com. Until next time, this is Bob Gaddy from Mark Bello, signing off from Justice Counts.